All right, the button has been hit, which means we are now on record. Welcome back, everyone, to Philosophy for the People. This is part 2 of the discussion we started a couple days ago on natural law and sexual ethics. Heads up, old Patsy here still feels like a flaming pile of garbage. Still have whatever is going on with this flu, so I'm mostly going to be quiet and kind of cough with my mic muted, and let these fine gentlemen just continue their conversation. As you will see if you are attentive, we have a new person here joining us. Some of you may recognize him from the conversation that we had. Very good one, very fun one that we had. Boy, maybe how long ago was that, Matthew? Now,
maybe like 3-ish months.
A couple months. But anyways, yeah, Matthew, quickly, if you don't mind, just reintroduce yourself for people who might not be familiar with you, and it's good to have you here. And then we'll get started.
Yeah, hi. So my name's Matthew. I'm an undergraduate studying philosophy at the University of Michigan. I'm currently in Oxford for a year studying abroad. I have a YouTube channel called Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions and a blog called Bentham's Newsletter. The blog is probably better than the YouTube channel, but they're both, of course, very good. That's basically who I am.
Yeah, good. Thank you. It's lots of good stuff. People can check it out. I'll give you guys the opportunity to mention the stuff you're doing again at the end. So where to begin? Well, I guess there was a lot we could have said last time, so we're gonna say, I guess, more of it this time. Brian, why don't we just start with you? Any initial way you want to kick this off, or thoughts you have?
Yeah. So I appreciate you guys being able to follow up so shortly after the first discussion, because the first discussion was Monday and now it's Thursday and we're doing this again. Part of that is I'm on spring break, and so my time is mine right now, but as soon as next week rolls around, it'll be a lot more difficult to do, you might say, like non-research extraneous things. So glad to be back, Pat. I just enjoyed the discussion on Monday, and from the looks of it, from the online comments, it looks like a lot of people did too. And I read through a lot of the comments that were posted. Some of them were useful and some of them were inane or worse. But they collectively helped me realize that some clarifications were in order, because I think, well, I'll summarize the way I think the discussion went in a second. But basically, I think that we were sort of spinning our wheels because I refused to think very deeply about some modal possibilities because they were outside of a neighborhood that I think is relevant to natural law. And so this made, especially people who don't work in ethics, but work maybe in epistemology or metaphysics, where such possibilia is, you might say the tools of the trade, flummoxed. And so, but I want to talk about more than just the comments, and we're going to get into moral metaphysics, but some clarifications are in order. So I want to start by thanking your viewers whose comments on the YouTube page were, I think, mostly quite useful and formative. And I also, so in addition to your YouTube viewers, I feel like Joe Schmidt deserves a bit of acknowledgement. So I should give this guy more credit than I normally do. I usually just troll him because he posts really, really long videos and really long comments on Facebook. So on the one hand, he does not have a gift of brevity, but what he lacks in brevity, he more than makes up for in intelligence and tact. And so he had posted some comments about modal skepticism on Facebook, and we may or may not get into them. But I want to give him credit and a shout out because I think that he's an eminent professional, even though he's still quite young. And I think this is particularly useful to talk about because he had moderated a debate with Dustin Crummett some years ago between me and Dustin Crummett. And it seemed clear to me during the discussion and afterwards that he favored Dustin's position. And now that doesn't really bother me because as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of people who like natural law. So, I just get used to it. This is kind of the way that philosophy life goes, is you have views that not everyone agrees with. Matthew loves shrimp, and I do too, but in a very different way. And so anyway, it's just part of the trade is you get used to staking out positions that are controversial. And so, but I think Joe is particularly to be admired, because despite the fact that he favored that view, he really didn't show any disdain for me. He didn't, ridicule the position. And I think for those who watch Joe's channel, you'll know that he's the sort of guy who will steelman a view, even if he thinks it's pretty difficult to defend. And so I just have to say I admire him for that. Now, if Joe is a model of professionalism, Amos, I got to kind of cast some shade your way, because shortly after the debate, I saw, and I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see. Where is it here? Hold on. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is your blog going AWOL, your Substack. And, as I read this, because you posted this without me, without sending it my way first, as I read this, I'm reading it and I'm like, wow, this is it's kind of harsh. This sounds like ridicule. In particular, I was reading this paragraph here. Brian's reply to this worry, which I really wasn't expecting, hinged on specific empirical facts about the nutritional effects of gum. Your rejoinder, sure, but what if it wasn't like that? Now, this is where things got, I thought, unprofessional. You wrote, Brian's response to this, which again, I was not expecting at all, was to say that my hypothetical was so far removed from reality that we can't have reliable intuitions about it. First of all, that's not my position. Second of all, it's important to point out, as you had to end up editing and adding, that I was the one who came up with a counterexample that actually fits your intentions perfectly, and that is the plastic straw example. And it didn't take me long to give you an example that was pretty close to actual reality. So as I continued to read this blog, I see this red-winged blackbird making a snide comment, which says, here's me. Well, fortunately, research has been done on gum, and it turns out it's A-okay. You say, I'm okay, but what if it didn't? And then I'm supposed to, in a very non-sequitorious way, say, I did, in fact, eat breakfast this morning. If I'm going to say Joe's a professional, Amos, I got to say, that doesn't strike me as professional. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen now and talk. To me, if a strategy involves making your interlocutors seem small or subjecting them to ridicule, then we've moved outside of philosophy. And so now I know that you're an undergraduate, and so is Matthew. I don't want to heap scorn on you for a low trick, but to me that seemed base and hardly professional. So let me just summarize the discussion, because it went on for an hour and a half, and mostly it was about whether or not gum can be chewed, if it's indestructible and flavorless, as well as whether Diet Coke that can pass through your body without a single effect is permissible. So first of all, why was I dragging my feet on acknowledging these possibilities? Well, certainly they're logical possibilities. They may be metaphysical possibilities, and they could even be physical possibilities. But those philosophers who are used to intuition pumping know that how you frame a discussion can affect your intuitions. So if Amos's description is, let's talk about a gum that is flavorless and indestructible, is it permissible to chew that? Well, I think the audience is going to start thinking about gum. It would be different if Amos says, hey, let's talk about small pieces of silicone rubber, because that is, it's not indestructible, but it is flavorless, and the polymers are indigestible. And so is it okay to chew and to swallow a small piece of silicone? Well, there, I don't think there's going to be intuition pumping, because we're no longer talking about gum. And so I think people's intuitions about an indestructible and flavorless gum may differ from intuitions about a piece of silicone. So if I'm going to be dragging my feet, it's because I think that, first of all, for natural law, what's going on in the powers matters quite a bit. especially when you're talking about those powers that supervene strongly on physical systems. Digestion seems like a very obvious one that has like a strong supervenience. And so the power of eating and digestion are closely related, and it's going to really matter, even if that's unintuitive for people who are used to, say, utilitarian ethics, where systems and empirical actually, that's a bad example, because in utilitarian ethics, empirical details matter even more than in my view. But maybe you're a Kantian, right? And you think to yourself, like maybe it's all up in the head, and so these empirical details shouldn't matter. For a person like that, my views are going to be counterintuitive. Okay, so
would it be fun if I just address that point briefly? So lots to say about what you've said so far, presumably much of which Amos is planning on saying.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing wrong in principle with a view holding that certain empirical details matter. Like, there are some empirical details of an act that really do matter. If you're deciding whether or not to move a knife, the empirical detail of whether the place you're moving that knife is where someone's face is located or into the knife drawer is a very important empirical detail. Where it seems natural law theory is unintuitive is that it seems to make what determines the rightness of an act be utterly irrelevant empirical details. So it holds that, for instance, in the
by your intuitions.
Well, yes, I'm not. I'm not reporting other people's intuitions. But so, for instance, if we think about like why it's permissible to chew gum, the utilitarian's answer of why it's permissible to chew gum would be that doesn't really have any effects. So there's no wrong-making feature. Well, the natural law theory.
That's not the utilitarian account.
Sorry, why is that not the utilitarian account?
Because a utilitarian is going to say an act is either going to be good or bad, and unless you've got a satisficing account, you're going to be maximizing pleasure in every act. And so if you're failing to do that, you're doing something bad. So doing harmless things may actually be bad if there was a better act, that is a more optimific act on the table that you avoided in so doing.
Well,
so also really saying it's neutral is not a utilitarian explanation. Well,
so there's also scalar utilitarianism. But the fact that gum, so the explanation of why chewing gum is not wrong is, well, it has some benefit, and it doesn't cause any harm. So there are no active reasons against it. Whether or not
there could be. So if you think about this more deeply, Singer's going to say spending money on chewing gum.
Can I finish my sentence? Whether or not it's going to be worth doing, all things considered, will depend on what the various alternatives are and so on.
But it's important to point out that spending, let's say, 79 cents for some double mint may actually be wrong if you should have spent that 79 cents on a shrimp charity that minimizes their pain. So it may actually be that natural law is more intuitive insofar as utilitarianism, at least of the kind you like, could often say chewing gum is morally wrong.
Well,
if that piece of gum would actually give more pleasure to a person around you than you shouldn't chew that gum. You should hand it over to the stranger.
Right. So, we can litigate utilitarianism.
And we should. If we're going to be comparing these views, it's not just natural law on the table. It's not in a vacuum.
Right. But I think even if you're not a utilitarian, I think there are plenty of views that are much more plausible than natural law. But so I agree. So utilitarianism. So I think the best version of utilitarianism is scalar utilitarianism, which holds that at the fundamental normative level, there are just different strengths of reasons to perform various actions. So strong reasons to say, you have much stronger reasons to say give the dollar away than to spend it on chewing gum. Now, I don't think that this is a particularly defective account if we think about what each action brings. So, like the utilitarian account, right? So maybe the utilitarian will hold that it's not optimal to spend money on gum if that money could be spent elsewhere, bringing about some much better state of affairs. But that doesn't seem that unintuitive when you think about that. There actually are some other people's interests that are relevant in this case.
It would be unintuitive if 79 cents spent on gum is morally wrong because you should have spent it to save shrimp. That would be pretty unintuitive.
Well, if the number of shrimp you could have saved for 79 cents is roughly 15,000 from a horrendous fate, it doesn't seem that counterintuitive to think that if you're foregoing preventing huge amounts of suffering which by conservative estimates is equivalent to the deaths of many, many people in terms of the total amount of suffering caused, for the sake of a stick of gum. It doesn't seem that counterintuitive. The thing that makes it counterintuitive in terms of its real world result is just that we live in a very morally weird world where it turns out that small amounts of money can do enormous amounts of good.
But okay, so on your view, you say that we're in this really weird world where empirical details matter quite a bit. And then, it seems like in the same breath, you're saying, but the details you care about, those are the details that are not intuitive. So I just want to make it clear for the audience. On my view, you can chew gum. You can spend that 79 cents on yourself and enjoy it. On Matthew's view, it may be wrong. In fact, it probably is wrong to chew gum because you should be donating to charities that save shrimp.
Well, but so as I said, I don't think that any action that fails to maximize utility is wrong. I think that there are just different strengths of reasons to perform different actions. And so if the idea is just the only thing the scalar utilitarian is committed to is that you have stronger reason to donate the money to the most effective charity than you do to chew gum. Now that doesn't seem so counterintuitive. If we think about what would a perfectly morally ideal agent do, would they spend the money chewing gum for their own pleasure or spend the money giving to charities that provide much greater benefit? It doesn't seem so counterintuitive. One could also adopt a satisficing account of utilitarianism, where they think that one only has an obligation to expend, for instance, some amount of willpower doing good. But I mean, again, even if you're not a utilitarian, I think natural law. I think there are lots of objections to natural law theory.
Maybe we should focus on those because I know Amos probably wants to talk about plastic straws. Or silicone.
He's big on plastic straws.
Let me just very briefly, because I do feel like I stole the show by talking about shrimp and utilitarianism, and I know those are stronger commitments that you, Matthew, have. So if I should briefly summarize, and then I'll leave it to Amos to talk, and we'll sort of follow up, because if any of the audience is like trying to look for some clarity and resolution, some finality from last discussion, it'd be good to get that in the outset. So my impression was Amos is concerned that chewing a plastic straw should be okay, especially if it helps avert some disaster. Now, very briefly, the reason why I dug my heels in is because there are real world examples where things are inert and chewing them we can analyze. But if it's the power of eating that's involved, right? We need to know, is somebody actually eating this or not? And their empirical details matter. It's part of the digestive system. It's something like a biological fact. And there could be modal neighborhoods that are not so very distant in which the digestive power is not being engaged. But I'm curious about our world. And I also am curious about not intuition pumping. So if you want to talk about chewing straws or chewing silicone, you also talked about a Diet Coke that was entirely inert. There's nothing like that. And if we're going to avoid intuition pumping about Cokes, we should probably talk about something that's a little bit more close to intuitive homes. And so I think that's mineral oil is probably the closest example that you had in mind, which passes through the body with almost no effects, at least in theory. Maybe some residual amounts are kept in the body. So my view is that chewing a straw is probably okay. I'm of two minds on this. So initially, when I was in the discussion on Monday, I thought chewing a straw is an act of eating. And if it's an act of eating, then the power, which is, the power that's involved in that act should be directed towards its natural end. Now, after I got off the discussion, I was thinking to myself, it's not clear to me that chewing has to be part of eating. And so to get into some of the moral metaphysics, I think we can make a distinction between at least two kinds of powers. Actually, there's probably more like 4 or 5 distinctions, but we'll start with two. Distinction between what I call constitutive powers and coordinative powers. And so when I think about coordinative power, I'm thinking of a power whose end is separable from the end of a further power. So reason may be a coordinated power. I use reason in a lot of ways. Reason assists me in the use of many powers. And so reason's end is a separable and you might say like sort of closed system. I should never use reason towards an end other than what reason's for, which I think is truth, and its natural function, which is the way that we ought to be using it, is just being rational. I should never use reason against its end, but I often use it coordinatively with other goals. So, for instance, I use reason to eat because I think, hey, this is edible. And so reason coordinates with the power of eating and brings to mind the particular food that I'm going to eat. All right, so why is this useful for chewing? Because it could very well be that chewing is a coordinative and not a constitutive power. And so it's more like reason. What's a constitutive power? Well, it seems like if you were to look at any particular power, it's going to be made up of smaller powers. And so there's a sort of like metaphysical depth to them. If you're thinking about eating in particular, you're going to be thinking about lots of autonomous biological processes, which together compose this larger power. So the constituted power would be eating. The constitutive powers may be like the excretion of stomach acid or bile, etc. All right. So hopefully this is not too fast, but initially in the discussion, I was thinking that chewing is a constitutive power. And so the constituted power would be eating, and chewing is one of the constitutive powers of eating, in which case chewing should always be directed towards the process of nutrition, because that's what eating's for. I should add, and I do like some of these comments because I could see that there was an unclarity. I made some moves that should be clarified. So it may seem like I said, well, eating is always for health. And that might open up the objection that, well, what about like, if you're thinking sexual ethics, what about prostate cancer may be benefited by frequency of ejaculation? Turns out that's not actually true, but suppose it was. And so could you just like, look at a lot of porn to decrease your risk of prostate cancer? We have to think about what powers are for both individually and for their coordinative ends. So there's sort of like these constellations. And so when we're thinking about the powers, we're thinking that they are aimed at something larger. So with the power of eating is aimed at our own health. But the power of eating satisfies health. It contributes to health by its own sort of like localized or smaller end. So its proximate end is nourishment. Its more final end is health. And so we understand the proximate end of nourishment in light of the contribution it makes to health. And so we should always understand the final end to be both constraining and informative for the proximate end. What do I mean by nutrition? I mean the sorts of things that taken in contribute to a person's overall physical integrity and health. So why would chewing for the sake of dental health be okay? Well, it would seem like what you're doing is nourishment in some broad sense, understood through the final end, namely health. And so that would cut off this possible avenue of, let's say, frequency of ejaculation in order to limit prostate, like risks of prostate cancer, et cetera. Because reproduction is not aimed at health. Reproduction is a distinct end. And so, same thing for drinking. Drinking is for health. And so it may be that drinking mineral oil has no contribution to nourishment or hydration, whatever. And so this is going to be close to the Diet Coke example, but it is for health. And so because the final end of the power is the informative part of the proximate end, it's still satisfying what should be satisfied. You're using the power in its natural way. All right. So long story short, chewing straws and drinking mineral oil or chewing pieces of silicone. I think my present inclination is to say that chewing silicone or chewing straws is fine because chewing is a lot more like locomotion than it is about eating. And so the power of eating is not really being involved there in chewing by itself, but it's a coordinated power, like reason's a coordinated power. So it's usually in assistance to the power of eating. It's most commonly part of the power of eating, but it by itself is not eating. And I think Amos kind of convinced me of that because he was talking about these scenarios in which, there's no increased salivation, etc. Increased salivation, for what it's worth, is actually part of digestion. Salivation is part of the first step of digestion. It's oral digestion, and there's saliva itself helps break down foods and fats, and so even if you were to chew something up and spit it out, you've actually eaten it. On my view. So like it's common in the Middle East to chew the roots of licorice. It's actually, I love licorice flavor. So I have these sticks. I almost brought one in, but you chew on it, you enjoy it, and then you just spit it out. It's a piece of wood. And so to me, I'm eating that licorice, even though I didn't swallow it, because everything worth digestion has already been digested in my mouth. So if chewing is more like locomotion, then you can chew anything. Just like you could like walk in circles if you wanted to. It doesn't really do you any good, but it doesn't really do you any harm. You're not using a power unnaturally. All right, I feel like I've now talked for, let's see, half an hour. So Amos, I don't know if you want to talk about that, get back into the examples. Let's see if it satisfies you.
Yeah, sure. So, I'll resist the temptation to address, the personal stuff at the beginning. I'll reply to that elsewhere.
Well, hey, you could talk about it. One of the things I wanted to do is
like calling Brian the name.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to do is I did not want to snipe you behind your back, because to me that's low. And so rather than post something on the internet about it without your opportunity to respond in person, I thought I'd just talk about it right here. So if you want to talk about it, that's fine.
No, I think I am going to resist because it'll probably derail into something, and there's no need. I'll reply to it elsewhere. I can even give you the opportunity to see it beforehand.
Okay.
But yeah,
seems like an improvement.
Yeah, I think that will derail the conversation. I should say, I contest Brian's characterization of things, but I'm happy to.
Well, I should add that even in your own Facebook feed, there were people calling for you to take this down until you better understood my position.
Yeah,
and I even sent this to you privately to make sure that you knew I agreed with it.
Yeah, I know you did. Yeah, again, I'll reply to this stuff elsewhere. I think that for the sake of the discussion, the audience probably doesn't care. So we may as well just focus on the. Well,
I think it's relevant because the audience will want to know if you're a good faith interlocutor.
Pardon?
I said I think it's relevant to this discussion because the audience will want to know if you're a good faith interlocutor.
Maybe the audience could sort of figure that out by the tenor of the discussion as we go forward.
Yeah, but if you're posting sniping comments afterwards that you have to clarify because they're so misleading.
Okay, I think certainly the least productive thing is to have a lengthy discussion about whether to have a discussion about it. I would vote to just have a brief discussion about it for like 5 to 10 minutes. But
again, I would vote
not to do that.
Yeah,
I put it out there because I think that you did me public harm, and I want to call you out on that because I think that I didn't do that to you, nor did I mislead my audience, nor did I have to add clarifications. And I'm making all this quite public. So if you want to talk about chewing straws, etc., that's fine. I'm prepared to do that. I've thought through these issues, and I'd like to respond to YouTube comments and your own concerns. But I don't appreciate being sniped behind my back, especially with no opportunity to respond.
Yeah, so I disagree that lightly making fun of a meta philosophy that I take to be indefensible and ridiculous counts as public harm. But I'm happy to send you what I write beforehand, afterwards, send it to you. But again, I don't think the audience will care. I would like to just talk about the substance of the issue, if that's all right. Because we didn't make a whole lot of progress on the plastic straw thing, and I really think that if you're willing to just talk about the issues, we can make progress and come to some resolution about the challenge. So maybe I should just sort of set up the contour of the challenge just so people knew what was going on, right? So in our original debate, I wanted to have a case where you were chewing something, and it turned out that like salivation and stuff was relevant. So a case where you chew something, you don't salivate, and you also don't take in anything. It also turned out that it didn't matter whether the things you were taking in were like dust or nutrients. It just mattered if they went into your digestive system. So I was thinking, we should. So you eventually agreed that, like a plastic straw is a case like this. And are we willing to stipulate that there can be cases where you chew a plastic straw and don't salivate?
Are you asking me, is it possible to chew a straw and not salivate?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Awesome.
So yeah, if we're happy with that version of the case, I don't think we'll need to cook up any sort of nearby possible world cases for the sake of the discussion. Okay, so if I understood your new reply correctly, so you're making a distinction between two types of powers. So there's like a broader power of eating, of nutrition generally, and then there's this like subsidiary coordinative power of chewing, and those are distinct. But I take it that they're directed towards the same good, which is nutrition.
Chewing doesn't necessarily have to be towards nutrition. I don't think so. If what I'm right, my reflective instinct, and this is one I think it's worth talking about this because professional philosophy I don't think is best done in this video format, and for precisely the reasons that have been highlighted in the last two discussions. And that is, as a professional philosopher, I don't like taking positions that I feel like I'm going to regret taking. And so if I'm reluctant, it's because I feel like I need to think through the issue more deeply. And I think that it actually bore out in this case, because as I thought about it more deeply, I thought, yeah, you know what, probably chewing is its own thing. So chewing, I don't think is for the sake of nourishment. And if throughout this discussion and the last discussion, if I say, hey, I don't know, it's just because I want to think about it deeper. And I think that it's worth doing that. Now, I think chewing is like locomotion, and what's locomotion for? It's for moving your body to help in the sake of your own happiness. It's a coordinated power with nearly all the other powers. And so it's a lot like walking.
Okay, cool. So it could be just focus on like chewing and eating as examples. Okay, so just to see that I've got the position right, there is a power to chew, which is not necessarily directed at the same good as the power of eating, right?
Yeah, seems right.
Right, okay. And so when I chew a plastic straw without intent to swallow any of the nutrients, which I couldn't reasonably intend to if I understood the nature of the straw, then I'm not perverting the faculty of eating because I'm engaging in a different power, which is the power to chew, which is not directed to the same end, so I'm not perverting it from that end. Is that
and to be clear, eating the straw, suppose you were like, what is it? Pica is the mental pathology that involves eating things that are not, am I getting the name right? Is it called Pica?
Maybe.
I think it's called Pica.
Okay.
Yeah, so eating, and this happens, so I often talk about this with my students who seem, despite the fact that the show was on years ago, still quite open to watching My Strange Addiction. I've never seen the show, and every description of it students have given me has disgusted me and made me repelled. But My Strange Addiction often involves eating things that are not food. So a woman eats her husband's ashes, dirty diapers, couch cushions. This is not perverting a faculty. It's and why? Because the power is still being used in its normal way, that is, its natural end-directed way. But the person is failing to do one of the constellations. They're failing to supply one of the circumstances that's part of the constellation for the success of the power. So if you look at my book, what I say is that there's two principles for circumstances. Powers have to be used in their natural way, but the circumstances also matter. Circumstances involving, first, that you're always doing what's necessary in that act to make the power successful, at least those things that are under your control. And so eating food would be a circumstantial detail necessary to make that act successful. And so a person would have a moral duty to eat food. Now, again, as I said before, what nourishment has to be understood as is part of physical health. So mineral oil, I think, would actually be something like nourishment insofar as it's a necessary part of digestive health. It's a laxative. And so if someone were constipated and there needs to be movement, they could drink mineral oil.
So would you be allowed?
Food only is a matter of circumstance.
So would you be allowed to, I don't know, to drink mineral oil if you weren't constipated, just if for like extrinsic reasons it would prevent something very bad? So imagine, someone's going to torture to death your entire family unless you drink some mineral oil. Do you get to drink mineral oil in that case?
I'd have to think about that. I mean, I want to say yes, but I also, as I said before, I don't like making commitments that I have to walk back. I mean, intuitively, it seems like that'd be fine.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so my intuition wants to say sure, but at the same time, I hesitate to commit to something that I have to retract later. So unless nothing comes to mind that would be a problem. So I'll just go with my intuition. Probably it's fine.
Yeah, my understanding was it sounded like what you were saying was that there's not merely do you have to use your faculties correctly as in not perverting them, but you also have to use them in ways that are sort of conducive to the ends of it, which is why there's something wrong with eating plastic straws.
That's right.
Or with eating things that are not food. But so then in a case where you eat plastic straws or consume mineral oil just to prevent, I don't know, your family from being tortured to death, it seems like you would be using the faculty in a way that's not conducive to the end of the faculty.
You would be violating a circumstance. But the reason I think that it might be okay, but then I'd have to work out the details, which I have not, is because this is not intrinsically wrong anymore. And so if it's not intrinsically wrong, it's wrong on the part of the circumstances. Then we have to analyze whether there are balance of circumstances that make it okay. Now, because my intuition wants me to say, sure, it's fine to drink mineral oil if it would save your family from torture, my initial investigation would be to try to figure out how circumstantial details could be developed where that works. It may be a lost cause. I don't want to say, I think philosophy, I'm constrained by truth and not by my intuitions. But my intuitions would say, because these are circumstantial details, and circumstantial details, we're no longer talking about intrinsic wrongness. There could be a balance of circumstantial details that favor drinking mineral oil.
Okay, so could we, could we still back to the original challenge, which... Sure. Yes, so, okay, the original worry, which I'd like to resolve with you by the end of this debate, had to do with these cases where you eat something, you don't get any nutrients, and you don't salivate. And then I was sort of saying, okay, whatever explanation you give on natural law theory for why this is permissible, it seems like there's going to be a version of it that I could copy and paste over when it comes to intrinsically non-procreative sex acts like masturbation, marital sodomy, gay sex, all of these kinds of things. So I'll just pick gay sex, but what I'm about to say could be duplicated for any of these types of activity. So the move in the plastic straw case was to make a distinction between two kinds of faculties, and then to say that the plastic straw, when you chew on it, you're just exercising the chewing faculty, not the eating faculty, even though the nom 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 aspect is still there. So, okay, go to a case of gay sex. So here's a plausible description of why someone in the real world might decide to have gay sex. So they might want to have gay sex because they want to know what their partner feels like on the inside. Okay, so here's the second power that I'm going to appeal to parody the power of chewing. It's going to be the power of touch, right? So I think plausibly it's going to be the case that you're going to say that each of the five senses is a power. So I assume that the power of eyesight is a power. That's often appealed to as an example, and that probably has something to do with knowledge, perceptual knowledge, and knowledge's role in action. I'm not entirely sure what the story will be, but visual perception is going to be a power. I take it. And if visual perception is a power, I'm going to want to say that tactile perception is also a power, because there'll be no non-ad hoc reason why.
I'm okay with that.
You happy with that? Okay, cool. So in that case, here's the thought. Somebody might have gay sex to engage in tactile perception. They want to know what it feels like, and they use the part of their body that's typically more sensitive than any other parts of their body to the touch. And with their partner, they go in, okay? And then we can stipulate that it's also an abortive act, so he doesn't intend to do it to completion. He intends to go in, out a couple of times and then stop, okay? So what I'm going to want is a non-ad hoc distinction for why one case is different from the other. So like, why can't I characterize gay sex as an exercise of the power of touching when we can, even though it has I won't do the parallel sounds to nom nom nom, but there seems to be some kind of a parallel there. So what do you take to be the morally relevant difference between these two types of activity?
Okay, so to start with, yeah, it seems like there would be a power of touch, and I'd say you might say that there's like a constitutive power of sensation, which is itself constituted by at least the five senses and maybe proprioception, like sort of sixth sense, and maybe other things too, maybe common sense. Maybe Reed was right. Anyway, so why is it wrong to use the power of touch to understand what it's like to sodomize a man?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, very simply, because it's not just the power of touch involved. You're also invoking a sexual power through sensual arousal, and you could tell that because you can't sodomize without an erection.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So a couple of things. Will it matter if the person is actually kind of quote unquote lusty at the time? Right. So
you mean physiologically aroused?
Is he what?
Physiologically aroused.
Well, yeah. So like he certainly has an erection in the case that we're imagining. But I'm wondering, okay, so like on natural law theory, will it be permissible to take Viagra as a standalone act?
I don't know.
Okay.
Just for fun, just to see what it's like to have an erection.
Well, like so I mean I just said a standalone act. In this case, I'm imagining he's going to
describe this scenario. This is why I was so dragging my feet is I want to know more of the details, because to me details matter.
Sure. I mean, so I'm happy to supply any details you want. All right. So I mean, in
it's
in
a
the
college
case,
student who doesn't know what it's like to have an erection, so he takes an ED medication.
Oh, so that could be a case, but the case I was imagining that directly bore on gay sex was one where somebody took a Viagra pill in order that they could see what sodomy felt like.
They can't just get an erection?
Suppose that they can't.
Okay.
That seems fine.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a standalone act anymore. So are we analyzing just the taking of Viagra or the taking of Viagra towards the end of sodomizing a man?
Yeah, I mean, so like you will think that there's a difference in those cases, but I was wondering,
certainly the second case is wrong. I don't know what to think about just taking Viagra for fun.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so, my thought with the touch stuff was, just because of physiologically how it works, you're going to need an erection to engage in this kind of touch, right? But like my thought was going to be that the reproductive stuff or like the reproductive aim of the organs or whatever is going to be an accidental byproduct. The power that was intended to be used is the power of touch in this case.
They didn't intend for sexual acts?
Well, define sexual acts. I mean, like we might need to in this case. So, colloquially, we would describe this as a sexual act. But if the intention is going to matter, and the intention is something,
the intention matters, but it does not determine the nature of the act always.
Right.
And so some acts by themselves have an intrinsic character. Otherwise, I think it's Abelard who has an intention exclusive view.
Sure.
I'm not an Abelardian. I think that intentions can change, but there's no matter my intention, when I start like jabbing somebody in the face with a knife, what I'm doing is harming them.
Yeah. Yeah, right. But so like intention will matter in the plastic straw case, I take it. So like
maybe not. I mean,
so like if I intend to swallow the straw afterwards but fail to, will that matter for the moral status of the act?
Bad intention, but they failed to, so the act itself is not going to be bad. Like the thing that they did was not bad, but the intention behind what they did was bad. So okay. I think three things have to be good for the overall action to be good. It's the act itself, which falls to the powers being used naturally, circumstances, and then intention. If any one of the three is bad, the act overall is bad.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So intention does matter,
yeah.
But I don't think that it's realistic to say that a person who wants to know what it's like to sodomize a man and likewise gets an erection and sodomizes a man is not engaged in a sexual act.
So
and likewise involving their sexual powers against their natural end.
Right. I mean, so like the thing under question is whether it turns the sexual powers against their natural end, right? So like that's what's under dispute.
Yeah.
So you know,
The
like
natural end is procreation. You can't procreate that way.
sure, right. But like the claim is that what he is intending to do is just to touch the inside of the man.
That doesn't seem psychologically plausible. He knows that he's got an erection, and he knows that his intentions are sexual intentions.
Okay, so
let me use because I know you had mentioned this case to me on Facebook after our discussion.
Yeah,
so let me just use maybe a clearer example where intentions could matter, where it's not clear that like a sexual power is being used. So I take it to be common. I've never been in an art class like this, but you see it on TV all the time where people have a nude model for a sketching class to learn the human form. And so a person taking this class may be, let's imagine a college student, right? Unmarried, no outlet for concupiscence. And so now they see a beautiful woman nude in front of the student. And initially he thinks to himself, hey, this is just for art. But then, he's self-aware and he realizes that there's more than art that's being activated in the power. And so, in the art class. And so there at that point, right, you've got the student has to make a choice because they know that their sexual power is now being used. Is it being used towards its natural end? Well, presumably not, insofar as this person is not his wife. And so the person would have to desist from the actions that are activating this power, even if initially that wasn't their intention. And even if they try to tell themselves through it all, this is just for art. I have to make sacrifices for art. Still, they know their sexual power is being activated, and the sexual power should only be voluntarily activated when it's being used towards its end.
So is there an important difference between intentionally activated and voluntarily activated? Because you chose that word at the end.
Yeah, I guess when I think intentionally, I'm thinking like it's done. The intention is the first cause.
Okay.
And so in this case, it wouldn't be intentionally, but it would be voluntarily. So voluntarily might be a broader category of actions where one has some control over its operation. So in the case of the art student, it would be voluntary to continue to experience an erection, not because you can just tell yourself, get down, boy, but because you can leave the room. And so if you don't, it may not be the intention that drove it. It wasn't the first cause, but still it's there and it's present. And the voluntariness of the act changes it. So you might say the person is excusable in the initial moments, but then as soon as they realize the sexual power is being activated, they need to desist from it because it's not directed towards procreation.
Right. So yeah, so it's true that if the moral constraints on doing things with an erection are as stringent as you say, that it's going to be impermissible for him to stay in the room when he knows what's happening, even though it wasn't directly intended. The challenge in question, the structure of it is to say, well, there's more than one permissible thing that you can do with an erection, or like so I claim on natural law theory. And so, okay, like I'll try and make like the structure of the challenge clear. Okay, so there's a nom that happens in the straw case, and you're carving out a different power that's distinct from eating, the power of chewing, whose use is permissible in this case. Okay, and then even though from the outside you're doing the same thing with your mouth. So like you're doing the same thing with chewing as you would do in the first stage of eating, right? Which is to go up and down with your jaws.
So you're thinking pelvic thrusting is like chewing.
Well, yeah, I mean that was the thought, right?
Okay.
So
just to be clear, because I wasn't following your thought, and then it occurred to me.
Yeah.
So you were trying to avoid the phrase pelvic thrusting.
Yeah, I mean, if that had occurred to me, I would have said it. But yeah, right. Okay, so
this is probably one of the racier episodes of philosophy for the people.
Hey, I
can't wait to see the reviews on iTunes after this when like Dad takes the kids on a road trip and gears up Pat Flint's podcast.
Yeah, kids, this one's not for you. The first
we should have
sentence.
said that at the beginning. Maybe it might be too late.
Oh,
Trigger warning:
whatever.
strobe lights and sex talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Right, and then the thought is like, just as there are there's like a range of permissible things that you can do when you do the nom 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 movement. So the challenge goes on a like non-ad hoc interpretation of natural law theory. There's going to be like a range of permissible things that you can do with pelvic thrusts while you have an erection. One of which is to exercise the power of touch. And like you intimated that this is like a psychologically unrealistic description of what gay men are doing when they have sex. But I'm not sure I even accept that claim, right? So
I'll leave it to the audience then to
sure. But can I say what the claim is so the audience can understand what the claim about the psychology is? That the psychological description of this person is someone who wants to sodomize another man in order to know what it feels like. Okay, so right, so like suppose they want to be intimate with their partner and they want to know what their partner feels like. I mean, so there are a range of permissible touch powers that
the usual phrase is sexually intimate.
Yeah, right. But I take it that you have a kind of stipulative definition of sex, which may not map onto the colloquial definition, and so I'm wanting to
let me just
split that apart.
I'm worried that we're going to do with sodomy what we did with plastic straws, and that is to go back and forth for like 45 minutes. So let me just try to avoid that because I know people are going to blame me for it in the comments. So to just quickly summarize,
They can blame me. I'm kind of the libertarian host here.
Hey, but you got an excuse.
No
sick,
rules.
Failure by omission.
Yeah. So to kind of get clear on this, in the original conversation, I was resistant to modal scenarios in which there was an indestructible flavorless gum and a Diet Coke, which literally was not absorbed in any way, which would mean that it's also a flavorless Diet Coke. And it would have to not be carbonated because the CO2 would become part of respiration. So this flat, it's mineral oil. Okay. So I resisted on both of those because I think the details of our physiological constitution matter for understanding what powers are involved. And here it seems like we're basically doing the same thing. Let's imagine a possible world in which a man wants to sodomize another man for entirely non-sexual reasons. I want to say that's even more far-fetched than indestructible flavorless gum and a uncarbonated, flavorless, and entirely chemically inert type of Coca-Cola. Is there a possible world? Is there a possible world in which that happens? Sure. Yeah. Okay. There's a possible world. I just don't think it is metaphysically possible, or if it's metaphysically possible, see, I think we'd be changing human nature at that point. But maybe we're not. Maybe it's metaphysically possible. It's at least so sufficiently modally distant that intuitions about it are not going to be useful for analyzing natural law. I think everybody in the audience knows a normal person sodomizing another is going to be doing it for sexual reasons.
Right. So think back to the Coca-Cola case. So imagine that there's some person who, for their entire life, they've been locked up, so they haven't been exposed to the real world. And so they don't know if there's this liquid. And they're trying to figure out if natural law theory is correct. And so you present one of these counterexamples involving, involving sodomy that doesn't induce sexual arousal, or a soda that has no detectable physical effects. On your view, it would seem that they would say, well, in order for me to know if natural law theory is correct or if it has decisive counterexamples, I need to know more about what the world is actually like. I need to know whether it really is a world that has flavor Coca-Cola with no effects. And that seems
Matthew, you make it sound like I'm biting a bullet here, but I absolutely think that natural law depends upon knowledge of the empirical and natural world. I think natural law, if it's a theory at all, just like utilitarianism, it's grounded in empirical details. And so here's maybe a similar example that maybe gets closer to Matthew's intuition, but it doesn't involve intuition pumping. Let's imagine I wanted to know what it feels like inside of a mouth. And so I take a finger, which is a non-sexual organ, and I say, hey, Amy, my wife, can I feel inside your mouth? I'm just curious what that feels like in there. Or I do that to myself. And then you think, yeah, that's totally permissible. It's you've got the faculty of touch. and it's really obvious. Ordinary people can do that without being sexualized.
Right.
What I'm denying is that sticking a penis in an anus is ever like that.
Right. So it may be that there are some empirical details about the world that affect the wrongness of some acts. My claim is that
yes, there may be.
Yeah. Well, my claim, I would normally think that those things would be related to the act rather than something else extraneous.
Yeah, I think sodomizing a man is part of the circumstantial details that make it wrong.
Okay, but my claim is that, for instance, if you want to know whether sodomy is wrong, you wouldn't need to first figure out if there are liquids that are like diet soda, except they don't have any other health effects.
Yeah, the Diet Coke example, the reason I bring that up is not because it's like sodomy. It's because in both cases, we've got a fairly modally distant connection. And so I think that it involves, you might say, fallacious intuition pumping in order to talk about this as Coke or as gum. And so I think the intuition is being driven by the category gum or Coke. And I think if we just change the category to something more realistic, the intuitions will track better.
Okay, so we don't have to call it Coke. We can call it, I don't know, give it some other name. Smoke.
Yeah. And I call it mineral oil because that's actually pretty close to what it is.
Right. But, I know you have other responses to this, but I'm just saying why I don't think it being a distant possible world is relevant. But so assume that, it does. So imagine we're trying to figure out if natural law theory is right, and we think if natural law theory is right, then all sorts of acts. Then sodomy, for instance, is wrong. It seems like if the person in the cave who hasn't been exposed to the world, if they're trying to figure out if sodomy is wrong, they don't need to know if there's a liquid that's like Coke, but that doesn't have any health effects.
I don't think that you have to know about Coke or mineral oil to know if sodomy is wrong. I think you need to know about the sexual power. And the mineral oil is about the nutritive powers.
But if they're trying to figure out if natural law theory is true, consider any far distant case, like one involving liquid that's like this, that is such that you think it's sort of only present in a distant possible world. But were it to be present, natural law theory,
I think it's actually in our world, mineral oil.
Okay, sure. Right. I was just explaining why I think, I was just commenting on the notion that whether or not natural law theory is right will hinge on highly specific empirical claims about the world, and that we can't rely on, say, cases where we imagine a counterexample involving a substance like Diet Coke, but with no nutritional effects. And my objection to that was, if your view says that if you think whether or not natural law theory is falsified by that will depend on whether or not that is actual, then for the person in the cave who doesn't know what the world is like, then in order for them to come to a judgment about other unrelated acts like sodomy, they would have to first know if there is in fact this liquid, which seems very counterintuitive.
No, I don't think that follows at all. So I think what you're thinking about in terms of analyzing natural law is you would only be able to make a judgment whether it's true if you could analyze every possible scenario and all its implications. And I think that's false. I think you could know the natural law is true by weak generalization from things that seem obvious that it explains pretty well. And so, Amos had suggested to me maybe not making this exclusively about natural law. So maybe as by way of response and to not make natural law the exclusive, I think here's one thing that the person coming out of the cave would know, and natural law is going to explain really well. And they could endorse natural law, at least on the basis of its good explanation here. So, and I'm going to actually make this case for both of you guys to see what you have to say. It's increasingly common as family structures are split apart for biological relations to, when split at early ages, experience strong sexual arousal towards each other if reunited later on, after puberty. So there have been cases that have emerged in the news of biological sons and their mothers, siblings, fathers and daughters, etc. All right, so let me take a case, since both of you are young men. Let me have you imagine that you discover that you were adopted. And unbeknownst to you, your parents that you were claimed to be your biological parents are not. They're actually your adopted parents. And you're approached by a woman and you confirm it. Let's imagine a plausible story where you do one of those genetic tests, right? And there are these like ethics issues about it, but it turns out that they'll like link you up with people they think are your relations. So you find out that you're like extremely close match to this woman about 20 years your senior, and you connect with her. And she tells a very plausible story about how she put a child up for adoption and how you are very likely to be that child. And genetically, it would make a ton of sense. In addition to hearing this story, you find yourself extremely aroused by her. And it's visible that she is very aroused by you. She also has a hysterectomy, as she makes it clear. And if you want to make it really obvious that you cannot have children in this case, let's imagine that you were convinced by David Benatar that children are bad or something. And so you had already gotten your tubes tied. You give all your money to the shrimp, none for your children. And so here's mom and she's looking hot. Is it permissible for you to engage in sexual relations with her?
Wait, sorry. So before we discuss that, I do want to just say one more thing about where you and I were going back and forth. So I think maybe you're slightly missing the point. The idea is just if there's any, so there were lots of cases where there were apparent counterexamples to natural law theory, and you would object to them on the grounds that they're too distant from the actual world. Okay. And
well, no, my objection is not that. I think that was one of the misunderstandings of the last discussion. My objection was that intuitions garnered on the basis of modally distant neighborhoods are going to be unreliable as evidence against natural law, precisely because in many cases we're stretching to see whether that's even involving human nature in the ways that it looked like. So in the indestructible gum case, I'm not sure whether you're eating it or not. It's too modally distant. So is it going to be good evidence against natural law? Well, only if we have strong and pretty clear intuitions about it. That's the objection. Not that these are not possible worlds, but that the intuitions about it are not going to be useful.
Right. So I don't think that's substantially different from what I was saying. But so if you have a case, so consider just any case where there's a difference between so there might be other objections to that the natural law theorist will give to some of these cases, right? So in for example, the like Coca-Cola like liquid that simply passes through without having any nutritional effect. In that case, you raise various other objections where you think maybe this is fine for other reasons, not just that our intuitions aren't trustworthy because it's too modally distant, doesn't involve human nature, but So maybe there are other objections, but I think this objection by itself cannot be right against any counterexample, because if it were right, then it would imply. So if the argument is such that it would otherwise succeed if it weren't for it being modally distant, then you'd get a case where very counterintuitively, if there was a person who was just very uninformed of the facts about the actual world, like whether it has a liquid like this, then they ought to, before coming to a judgment about natural law theory, need to know what kinds of liquids were present in the world, because if this kind of liquid is actual, then it's not too modally distant, and thus it serves as a counterexample. So that was the other point.
I don't think that that's the way people come to a theory. And so for fear of being bogged down in like a plastic straw kind of example, I don't think that people come to theories like that. I think that they can generalize from a few successful explanations. And so I guess I'd probably like to talk about one that I think is pretty obviously successful. We could continue to talk about whether a person has to understand whether there is mineral oil in the world before they can arrive at natural law.
Right. Well, so it doesn't have to be how you come to a theory. All that needs to be the case is that there is some fact about the world. There exists some scenario where if that scenario were actual, like if that were true of the actual world, then that would be a counterexample to natural law theory. I'm saying if that were true, then noting that scenario is in a modally distant world, that is not going to be a decisive objection.
Yeah, you're talking about epistemic sorts of modal distance. My point is that that's not how people arrive at theories, right? Whether they know that there is mineral oil or not is not why. So you're saying that the only way that they could come to natural law is if they've thought through every potential counterexample, and whether they know the potential counterexamples are in modal neighborhoods close to ours or not. I'm saying no. People don't come to theories.
That's not what I'm not. what I'm saying does not require thinking anything at all controversial about how people come to theories, other than if you find a counterexample to a theory that falsifies it, then you shouldn't believe the theory. The point is...
Yeah, so are you saying that this would be a defeater for the theory, or the ignorance about it would be, like, so merely ignorance, or knowing that there is this counterexample?
So let's just grant, let's assume that were the Coke-like liquid to be actual, that would falsify natural law theory.
Okay, so just to be really clear, because I'm not tracking what you're trying to say, what is the defeater? Is the defeater ignorance about whether the actual world contains a material like that? Or is the defeater the realization that the actual world has a substance like that?
The thing that I'm saying is implausible is that the person in the cave considers the possibility of there being a liquid like this. And then they think to themselves, well, if there is a liquid like this, then sodomy's fine because natural law theory is false. Well, if there's not, then sodomy is immoral.
Yeah, I don't think that cave guy is realistic. I mean, we could have a whole separate debate on that. To me, that's pretty absurd.
Wait, sorry. So what about the scenario is absurd? Just like that a guy's in a cave and doesn't know about the world?
Well, first of all, as I asked you directly, I don't know what the defeater is supposed to be. The defeater is supposed to be something like this: the realization that there could be a liquid like mineral oil, and they don't know whether or not it would violate the use of the eating power. And they're supposed to also have this intuition that it would be perfectly fine to drink mineral oil. And the intuition's so strong that despite the fact that they've lived in a cave, they can now dismiss natural law on the basis of its slightly counterintuitive implications, which I'm not even sure what to say about.
It's not just slightly counterintuitive, because the principle would be that you
drinking mineral oil for fun, whether it's right or wrong.
The reason it's not that it's not only slightly counterintuitive is that the case could involve, say, needing to drink mineral oil to save the world. And there, I think it's very obvious.
So this guy in a cave is thinking about drinking mineral oil to save the world. And even though I, who've tried to think as deeply about natural law as I can, don't really know what to say about it, guy in cave has come to some decided and very strongly intuitive conclusions from his own epistemic position, so sufficiently strong that he can reject natural law and likewise endorse sodomy. That's the counterexample?
Okay. I'm making a point. I'm not giving a counterexample to natural law theory. I'm making a point about whether or not my claim is that it is not a sufficient objection to an otherwise convincing counterexample that it's distant from the real world. And the reason for that is that if you imagine
people in positions where they wouldn't know if it's distant or not. Yeah, but the scenario that you've described, which tries to illustrate that, is so far-fetched. I mean, it's not just modally distant, it's just epistemically weird. I don't think that provides a defeater for the guy.
Right. I mean, if a person was sufficiently villainous, they could actually set up the scenario where, they kidnap some person at birth, put them in a cave, give them a bunch of books on natural law theory.
Can you be really clear about what the epistemic details are? Because I still don't know what the defeater is supposed to be.
Okay. Let me use my host powers here and say, and I want to be charitable. I think there's just a certain disconnect that you guys can probably easily hash out in 2 minutes of a Facebook chat conversation. So I just want to congratulate both of you for a valiant attempt, but I'm on a time crunch, and I want to just at least spend the last little bit of time that I have here, I guess, if you guys are cool with it, swinging back to the thing that Brian proposed.
I do actually, sorry, there is one objection that I would really like to get to discuss at some point, but okay, sure. Yeah, we can talk about.
We can always do a part 3, if if everyone is up for it at some point or whatever, but there was no agreement in advance, but it did sound like you guys wanted to kind of split the time. So I want to kind of like honor that at least initial upfront thing. Unless Brian, you're cool with it.
No, I'd like to hear what they have to say about incest.
Yeah, sure. So, I think I can speak for Matthew when I say, like for both of us, there are going to be cases where in some possible worlds and maybe some cases in the actual world, incest is permissible. Matthew, you agree with that?
So let's not just talk about possibility. I gave you an actual case.
But no, you didn't give us you gave an actual kind of case, which may or may not describe an actual case.
So just give me the details you want more of.
I mean, so like it doesn't matter which details I want more of, because I agree that there are going to be cases where this is permissible, right? So like,
So you think it is actually fine for you to sleep with your mom?
in some cases, yeah.
In the case that I described.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so there are going to be cases where that's permissible.
You say there are going to
like,
be cases. Are there
yeah.
details that the audience should hear, qualifications? Because I described what I think to be a sufficiently detailed case. Is there stuff that needs to be present or absent that would make it okay, or is the case just as
Can you remind me whether the person knew about the blood relation?
Well, it's supposed to be you, Amos. It's supposed to be you and your mom. And yes.
Right. I mean, yes. So I know you want to say something with like I and then ... and then you know that can be the moment of the debate, right? But yeah.
Don't worry,
so,
I promise I'm not going to displace any clips or
like
that. Right,
headline: Amos says it's fine to sleep with his own mother.
If I remember the scenario there was the genetic test involved or something like that, right? Sorry, I'm a little fuzzy over here.
Yeah, so like it would definitely be wrong given facts about me, my mother, and the relationship between me and my mother having to do with our psychologies, and also to do with like positionality, things like that. There'll be like reasons of virtue. So like on natural law theory, some natural lawyers, like I think you and also Tim Shao, say that the reason it's wrong to torture a pig for days and days and days has nothing to do with considerations about the pig. It has to do with contingent effects that will have to do on your psychology. Okay. And so the reply I'm going to give that applies to many actual world cases, including cases involving me, is that consensual incest will be wrong for the same reason. But if you stipulate
like
those
what particularly psychologically, because you know, for Tim's view, he could talk about cruelty. That's exactly what he does. So what's the psychological feature? Is it disgust? Is it self-disgust?
Yes. So like it's extreme. It's an extremely morally risky action because it has like a high chance of causing self-disgust and related negative emotions in both parties.
I also think that when it comes, there are certain norms that tend to be very important for the functioning of society, including that there's a strong divergence between the people who you have familiar relations with and the people who you have romantic relations.
Talking, Matthew, are you appealing to rule consequentialist sorts of?
No, I'm not appealing to rule consequentialist justifications, because it's not just that following this rule typically has good consequences. It doesn't. It's perfectly compatible with active utilitarianism. The point is, if there's a general rule that works really well, even if you think that you've identified a case where violating the rule would produce good consequences.
This sounds like Hooker.
Then I think it. Well, okay, it's. I don't think it is, because it's, as I said, it's compatible with active consequentialism. Even if you're an act.
Hooker's way to rule consequentialism is act consequentialists should be rule consequentialists.
Okay. Well. So I think generally rule consequentialism doesn't just say you should follow rules that where you following them will have good consequences. It says that you should follow rules if the general adherence to those rules has good consequences, and that's something that it's not committed to. But okay, whether or not it's rule consequentialism, so if there's some norm where violating the norm almost always has bad consequences, and you think that people who are in the position where they're deciding whether or not to violate the norm, like they might be biased, for instance, they might be biased in various ways, then I think it makes sense to have a really, really strong bar for adhering to that rule. But I do think that the natural law position on incest is fairly implausible. So let me just describe two reasons for this. One of them is the natural law position on incest implies that, for instance, if sleeping with your mother would prevent both you, your mother, and everyone else in the world from being tortured to death in the most brutal way imaginable, then it would be absolutely prohibited, which seems very counterintuitive. Second of all, I think that I don't think that having just like a firm bright line of incest is prohibited makes a lot of sense when you consider the following feature about incest, which is that there's no like precise line for where people are members of your family. So everyone agrees that you get to sleep. There exists some number n such that you get to sleep with your nth cousins, because everyone is your nth cousin.
These are called degrees of consanguinity.
Right. And so the natural law theorist has to posit this like this arbitrary seeming bright line where you get to sleep with. So I don't know exactly where they would say it, but you get to sleep with your second cousins, but there's an absolute prohibition on sleeping with your first cousins.
The norms, the Catholic Church would frequently require 10 degrees of consanguinity, which is pretty far distant. But that you're right. There's
okay. I mean, I guess that
arbitrariness.
my sense is, I think like most Ashkenazi Jews are less than that generations removed.
Probably,
so would most Ashkenazi Jews be not allowed to have sex?
It was a matter of arbitrary determination. So 10 degrees separate of consanguinity. You're right. It's somewhat arbitrary.
Right. And so
I'm not talking about kissing cousins here. I'm talking about sleeping with your mom.
No, I know. But I was talking about the natural law theorists' view. So in my judgment, what's a more plausible way of accounting for this, rather than having some absolute natural law cut off, is to just say that there are certain reasons not to engage in incest in typical cases. Maybe there are certain cases where these break down, and these cases tend to get stronger as you get to closer family members. So for that reason, it'll be worse to sleep with your parents than with, your first cousin. They're both bad. It would be worse to sleep with your first cousin than your second cousin. Maybe at the point of your second cousin, maybe then it's only a little bit wrong. Because if natural law theorists holds that some actions are just absolutely deontically prohibited, then I think it won't fit very well with the fact about incest, that incest comes in degrees, and locating any precise cutoff is going to
seem like eating food versus eating non-food. Sleeping with someone who's a not positive procreative partner can vary by degrees, and it's a circumstantial detail. It's one of the constellation goods that I talked about. So when you need to have food in order to hit nourishment. We also need to have a positive procreative partner in order to procreate. And so you might say that the degrees of, sort of like moral variance are going to depend on the degree of positivity and the procreative process, just like you're going to have food that is more and less nourishing. And so it's not arbitrary. The principles there are pretty clear based on the telos of the power. But to me, as I hear Matthew and I hear Amos talking, it sounds like two different explanations. And maybe you guys want to synthesize, but just to focus on Amos for a second, Amos, it sounded like the reasons have to do with contingent psychological features. And so perhaps you and any right-thinking individual would feel a sense of self-disgust if they began to sleep with their mom. But there's a fair number of people for whom physiological arousal is strong. And, I don't know, who's that? There's a lady, she's really popular with female academics. It's like Brene Brown, I think her name is. And she's like been in this like real push about how shame is this really awful emotion and shame is something bad. So you could imagine someone who both experiences strong concupiscence and who's been convinced that shame is this really awful destructive feature that is only present in a person's mind from socialization. And now this person rejects as a reason their whatever psychological self-disgust they experience. They reject it because they feel like that's been imposed from the outside. And you might think that this is not so far-fetched insofar as active homosexuals during periods where it was stigmatized would have had to do something similar, right? It may be that someone who was raised in a home in Victorian England would have experienced extreme self-loathing if they would have engaged in sodomy. And it doesn't seem to me like you'd want to say, I mean, given your views, you might want to say they should actually not engage in homosexual behavior, even if they have strong pulls towards it, because of the contingent psychological features. Now, maybe you actually say, no, those psychological features are harmful. They should resist them, and they've got moral reasons to resist them. But if that's true, then it also seems like a person today might have reasons to resist the socialized restrictions against incest. Maybe they could think, well, the reasons those are there are because, generally speaking, incest is bad because people generally have babies with their incestuous partners and those babies get screwed up. But my mom has a hysterectomy and my tubes are tied, so it's impossible and these norms don't apply.
Yeah, right. So like I'm happy to agree actually that in times past, many people with the same sex attraction shouldn't have had sex with other men because it was too morally risky for contingent social and psychological reasons. And like mine and Matthew's explanation were the same, right? So we were saying there are a range of contingent psychological and sociological features that in many actual world cases make it ex ante risky to have sex with your mother or to have sex with any close relative, and that this shades off, the further the cousins get. But
so what's the norm for engaging in risky behavior? Because it seems like you're not going to have an absolute deontic norm against riskiness. So, like, could you describe a scenario in which it's okay to sleep with your mother?
Yeah. So, okay, I believe in souls. So, I could be reincarnated in another possible world, and in that possible world, I would have a different mother. Okay, and then and then it could be such that we've never met one another before, and there's no social taboo against incest.
So you're saying it would be okay to sleep with your mother's soul if you are both reincarnated bodies?
No, wait, obviously not. So I just said reincarnated. So like the souls are put in bodies. Souls aren't sleeping with one another.
No. That's what I said. I said that it would be okay if you slept with, because it's no longer your mother, right? Your mother's gone. It's your mother's soul in a new body.
No. So no, sorry. I was imagining a case where my soul gets reincarnated in another body. Okay, and in this world, I have a biological mother, right? Because somebody had to give birth to the body in question. Okay, and then in this possible world, we're separated, tubes tied, blah blah blah. There's no social taboo that makes it kind of risky for like self-hate reasons, blah blah blah. And you know that like we would never sort of like we wouldn't put our own social status in grave danger by doing this or risk doing that, blah blah blah. Okay, in that case, I'm going to say it's morally permissible.
Okay, so I'm just trying to get clear on the details here. You're talking about you're no longer Amos.
No, I am Amos because I think that I'm identical to my soul, so it would be me.
Got it.
I might be called Brian, for example, and in this case, you know, Brian might be able to sleep with his mother permissibly.
Okay, so if we talk about
just
Amos
real quick,
Star,
I got to wrap up in about 5-ish minutes.
Okay,
if that helps you, Brian, where you want to go with this.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds to me like you've put a pretty high bar. In fact, it seems like an extremely high bar. You have to both be reincarnated in different bodies before you can sleep together.
No, so you didn't ask for the exact point at which it becomes permissible. You asked for a case where it would be permissible. So I gave you a case.
Okay, like a realistic case where in this world, barring reincarnation, it's always wrong.
No, it's not always wrong, but it's very often ex ante risky.
Okay, so I mean, like, it seems like it's fine to engage in some risky behaviors if the costs and benefits. I mean, like, it seems like a person.
Yeah. Sometimes, so like I already said, like in some actual world cases, incest is going to be permissible, and in many modally distant cases, it will also be permissible.
I don't know if there might be actual worlds where it's permissible.
I assume there's at least one because there are 10 billion people in human history as well.
I don't know, but certainly in various middle distant cases it'll be. But sorry, okay, so can you explain? So I was explaining why I think the natural law theory account of why incest is wrong is implausible, where it's going to have arbitrary seeming cutoffs, and in particular when you just consider the degree of wrong, where it thinks, you know, natural law theorists will have to think there exists some n such that it's fine to have sex with your nth cousin.
You can marry them, yeah.
But sex with your n minus 1th cousin, you should not do, or sorry, n plus 1th cousin, but you should not do, even to prevent the extinction of life on Earth. And that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, no, that actually isn't true. And the reason why is, although you've got procreated partners of varying degrees of positivity, even pretty close relations can, I think that the rates in the first generation of incest-based genetic problems are actually pretty low. It rises up to like 25%, but I think it takes actually like 3 or 4 generations for those to creep up. And you can imagine scenarios where these could be eliminated. Now, you're talking about sleeping with, obviously, in natural law, you need to be married because it's part of the circumstances for good sexuality. I guess since we have to close it for the audience, one of the benefits of natural law is that it can explain pretty nicely facts that most of us take for granted as Morian facts, like it's always wrong to sleep with your mother. Even if, on Matthew's view, it averts the apocalypse, I think most people are gonna be like, "Yeah, just let the apocalypse occur. I'm not sleeping with my mom."
I don't think that's true. Like
Okay.
really, just imagine a scenario it's like everything, you and your mother are going to be tortured. Everyone else in the world is going to be tortured in the most brutal ways.
Hey, I'm going to torture myself for all eternity if I sleep with my mother, and that's the worst torture because I accuse myself. Right? The torture is from the inside.
well, we could imagine your memory of it would be erased and so on. Like, we could make it a maximally unfavorable scenario for you. But sorry, so I guess I don't get what your response was to the arbitrary cutoff point. You said several things.
Yeah, I just endorsed it. I said that you're right, that there is a degree of arbitrariness, and I don't think actually that's a problem.
Wait, sorry. Okay, so I remember at the beginning you said that isn't right. Right after I said that.
Yeah, what I was saying is that you were saying n plus 1 is okay, n minus 1 is wrong. I said that's not actually true. And so the degrees of consanguinity have to do with available procreative partners. If your only food is food that is only very, very barely digestible, you might say it's okay to eat it, even though if there's alternatives, it would be far better for you to eat those. Sleeping with close cousins may be like the very barely digestible food, the very barely nourishing food. And so there could be circumstances where this is the only available option, like the scenario you posed, where life extinction is going to happen. Now, does that mean it's fine to marry your first cousin or your sibling? No. But it's not. I endorse the arbitrariness, and I actually think that this is the way that most intuitions are colored. Nobody has like third cousin's fine, second cousin's good, or second cousin's bad and third cousin's fine. I don't think that's the way our intuition. I think most of our intuitions, the closer the consanguinity, the worse it is.
Sorry, so
and I can explain that really nicely.
Okay, so just to be clear, the idea is that if you, the reason why it's worse, it's that it's like greater degrees of wrongness if it's someone with whom you'd produce more genetically malformed babies. So it's worse with your mother, and so it's analogous to food where it's less nourishing. Okay, yeah. So
I actually think it's going to be an absolute prohibition against immediate incest.
But so will there be an absolute
cousins?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess it will still seem implausible that there's the cutoff at which it becomes absolutely deontically prohibited.
I didn't say that there was such a cutoff.
Well, do you?
But except for the immediate family. I'm talking about cousins. As I said. So I assume that you're talking again about cousins.
Right. So there are some, you get to have sex with your 156th cousin, and you get to marry and have sex with, and you don't get to marry and have sex with your first cousin. And in fact, with your immediate family. And so there has to be some point branching off from the familiar structure, some first point at which you're absolutely prohibited, so that you can't do it no matter what the stakes are. But sorry, and so the natural law theorist account of why incest is wrong.
And very briefly, just so the audience is not left thinking I don't have an answer for that, the deontic prohibition could well be grounded in the fact that immediate incest of that form is almost always harmful. Not almost always harmful to the children. And so whereas cousins have, it seems like, greater and greater degrees of harm.
Is it harmful because it makes the child worse off than it otherwise would have been?
It's not. Yeah, I know that those sorts of puzzles about
right. I mean, because
I know you like population ethics types puzzles, but I know that that's actually blending two problems together.
Well,
I owe to future generations that are not actually here.
Go on, yeah.
Yeah. So sorry. So it turns out my understanding is that if people above a certain age, if they have sex, their children will tend to have genetic defects. So in your view, would that be absolutely deontically prohibited?
To have sex when you know
that last point, guys. Yeah, last point. Just let Ryan respond and we'll wrap it up.
Yep. Yeah, before menopause.
Okay. Yeah. Would that be absolutely deontically prohibited?
I'm sorry, Matthew. When Pat cut in, I got distracted by what you said.
Yeah. So a year before menopause, a couple wants to have sex to avert the apocalypse. Let's say, is that absolutely deontically prohibited on the grounds that if they had children, their children would be likely to have some genetic defect?
No, it's not wrong. Geriatric pregnancies do have a higher risk of problems, but these are actually much smaller than the risks that are involved in incest.
Okay, so suppose, tomorrow someone...
So Amos, it seems like you're laughing because you think that these empirical details don't matter, but I do think that we owe it to our children to not put them at unnecessary risk.
I agree with that. Yeah, and I think, yes, we ought, there's obviously a strong reason to not put our children at risk. But the claim is that this won't be plausible at identifying the anti-incest intuitions So suppose that, tomorrow someone publishes a big study and they say, actually, we've systematically overestimated the rate of genetic defects from incest, from immediate incest. So really the rate is only the same as from geriatric pregnancies. Suppose that this turned out to be correct. They turned out to be empirically right. Would this then imply that the two actions were equally wrong?
So I'm going to say that there are additional features besides the fact that procreation is not positive with immediate family members. There's additional features that it violates, particularly psychological norms, which are centered on, but I can explain the psychological norms. So they're not shallow. And this is one of the reasons I don't fall into the same problem against Victorian sodomy that Amos might. Namely, these psychological norms are grounded. The reason why someone should feel a sense of self-disgust and should not dismiss that as mere socialization is that these psychological norms are grounded in an empirical reality. If somebody made that claim, I would be highly dubious that it's true. It's not the first study that would have to be debunked after 10 more years of study. But you're going to have us imagine, okay, so imagine that the world is actually the way that it is. This is the actual world. I would say that there are additional features, these psychological features, which are grounded in the harms that are done, and flouting those features just to have a sex partner would not be morally permissible, that they would be harm to yourself.
Those features are entirely parasitic on the previous objection, which in this hypothetical doesn't hold, or at least like the rate.
I'm sorry, start over, Amos.
Yeah, so the psychological features having to do with shame, that explanation is entirely parasitic on the previous objection, which Matthew was challenging. So, like, should it turn out that Matthew's hypothetical claim is proven empirically, it would turn out that, like, the Victorian shame thing still applies to your version of the case. So you don't have any additional resources.
If it turns out that as a matter of fact, incest is totally fine for procreation, then I'm wrong.
That wasn't the case.
I just don't think that's our actual world.
So, the case was.
I know Pat's got a hard deadline.
Yeah, guys, we have to pause it there. I think
I'd be happy to do a part 3.
I'm always happy to host, so we can certainly discuss that in our little Facebook thingy. I do want to finish with a few things, a fatherly thing, if you will. All of you, of course, mentioned, where people can keep up with you and all that good stuff. And then I want to, there's been some heat in this discussion, but I appreciate that you guys were able to make it productive and attentive. I like all of our friendship. I genuinely do. Amos, we're new, but I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it. Matthew's been a friend for a while now. Yeah. I want you to finish with something nice to say about your dialogue partner today, and then tease whatever you want about your work you're on or wherever people can keep up. And let me say about the comment section too. I barely read that, but I did catch a glimpse in some stuff on Facebook. You guys are always welcome. Not you guys, like the larger audience. Disagree, argue all you want. Don't make me see something nasty. All right, just keep. There's a certain tone that I like to have on my platforms. All right, disagreement is fine. Arguments are the love language of philosophers. But you need to be an adult too. So let me just remind people all that. And I think all you guys were in this conversation, so that's great. Amos, Matthew, let's go with you, and then Brian will finish you again.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, a Cambridge compliment is you were the only one who turned out with a scholastic bookshelf behind you. So, we failed drastically in that regard. I would also like to say, you're probably, what happened last time, that there were some, very nasty comments directed at you from people. And, a lot of that was unjustified, especially when it got cussy or whatever. So I would like to discourage people from doing that. Matthew?
Yeah, I find you have a very impressive beard. This goes for both of you.
Okay, hold on. I was about to be left out.
This is like
there.
Robert Audie's letter of recommendation, where the recommender says that they have wonderful handwriting.
Yeah. I appreciate your sort of candidness in biting bullets. I think it's a thing they don't do enough. I think people are too unwilling to accept a view that has certain costs because they feel it has certain other explanatory advantages. So while I don't think natural law theory is right, and I don't think when you take into account all the considerations, it stacks up as being plausible, I appreciate a willingness to accept, to admit that your view has certain unintuitive consequences, but to think that overall, the broad explanatory project makes it worthwhile overall.
Well, I appreciate both of your kind comments, and I enjoy talking about this. If I push back Amos on what I consider to be, as it were, high-fiving the trolls and endorsing them in the blog post immediately following, it's only because I think that you did me public harm, and I wanted you the opportunity to be told to your face that I think that's unprofessional. But overall, I love talking to both of you, and I want to applaud your seriously thinking through the issues on natural law, because my impression is that exceedingly natural law is not understood. So for both of you to take the view seriously enough to try to come up with some counterexamples and some interesting ones, it's very useful. And honestly, it's useful to me because if I live in an echo chamber, I won't think through some of the deeper metaphysical issues. And I think it's useful for natural law too. So I appreciate both of you as interlocutors, and maybe we'll have a round 3.
Yeah, great. Thank you all so much. If you're watching or listening, please do the usual stuff that tickles the algorithm. Subscribe, comment, like, share. We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.